Hello, a very good evening. It's 8 on LBC. I think one thing that we can all agree on is that there's a lot of armchair generals in the country at the moment. Many of them ring our station and tell us how they think the war in Ukraine should be conducted or whether there should be a no-fly zone and all the rest of it. We've all got our opinions. Most of them we like to think are well informed, but possibly not so much on occasion. So I thought today it would be a really good idea to do a phone-in where you weren't telling me your views or posing questions to me. You actually pose them to two people who know what they're talking about. So Michael Clarke joins us. You will know his voice. He's been on my programme an awful lot. You can see him doing his Peter Snow act on Sky News quite a lot during this crisis. He is a Defence and Foreign Affairs analyst, former Director General of the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI. And we also have Ben Judah with us from New York, where he is at the moment. He's author of Fragile Empire, a study of Putin's Russia. Good evening to you both. Now, I'm expecting some really incisive questions from our listeners today. The number to call, 0345 6060 973. Michael, let's have a little word before we come to our first question. Did you ever think that we would be in a situation in 2022 when we were looking at what could develop into a major European war?
No. The world changed last Thursday.
It did, didn't it?
New world since last Thursday. And we thought there would be crises. There might even be militarized crises. But the idea of a major war where Russia is attacking its Slavic neighbor was unconscionable. It looked a theoretical possibility before Christmas. There was something going on, and we all thought that President Putin was trying to frighten us all into making concessions on other issues, and that he was using Ukraine as a hostage, saying, if you don't change the order of Europe since 1991, I'll shoot the hostage. And we treated it like that, and then he maneuvered himself into a corner where he didn't have any choice but to do it, or he always intended to do this. He thought about it last year, he thought about it this year, and because of the collapse of Western prestige in Afghanistan last August, he thought this was his opportunity, and he's lied and lied and lied while he carried out the plan. I don't know which of those explanations is true, but one of them is.
Ben Judah, which of those explanations do you buy?
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show. Well, in terms of whether there was a possibility of a major war in Europe, I come from really the other side of it, which is over the last 15 years, we've seen a whole load of things that we believed would never happen. An international banking crisis. We've seen a pandemic. We've seen revolutions. We've seen the West defeated at war. And now, in hindsight, it looks very clear to me that the 1990s, the long 1990s, was a deeply ideological moment where we convinced ourselves of this it'll never happen impossibility. So I have felt that a major war in Europe was possible for a long time, because I was sort of shaken out of that sense by living in Russia and by watching Putin's first war of aggression, which was the war in Georgia in 2008.
Great. Well, we've got lots of calls coming in already. 0345 6060 973. Let's go to Ewan, who is in Lucerne in Switzerland. Ewan, hi.
Hi. Very good to speak to you. Quick question. There's a rumour going around that Russians are fleeing the country because martial law is about to be introduced. What does that mean?
Ben?
Well, I can confirm that is happening. The Russians are currently fleeing the country. And let me just explain why they are. Over the last 48 hours, we've seen a shocking escalation in repression. Putin's fighting two wars, one on Ukraine, one on Russian society. We've seen the last liberal radio station taken off air, the last liberal online TV station taken off air. We've seen over 7,500 people arrested, and those are only people arrested that we know about that have been counted. We've seen the Duma move towards law projects that would make talking about fake news from Ukraine, which you're not allowed to describe as a war, only as an anti-terrorist operation, punishable by 15 years in jail. And Even it's been reported people as close to the Kremlin as Ksenia Sobchak, that's a Russian celebrity of an opposition streak, who is nothing less than the daughter of Putin's first, major boss and mentor in political life, Anatoly Sobchak, who was the mayor of St. Petersburg, who launched him into politics, has fled the country. And just to give a sense of the gravity of the emotional moment, like that woman who was reported by the editor of Echo Moskvy has fled the country. Putin cried at her father's funeral. There are photos of her sitting next to a kind of tearful Putin back at that somber day. And as recently as 2018, there are pictures of her sort of shaking hands with Putin and visiting the Kremlin with various requests. There's a moment of real fear in Russia, fear that something similar to the Stalin period is about to happen. And liberal-minded Russians have no belief that they're going to be able to resist this or stand up to this, because a whole series of actions which looked spiteful and incomprehensible to us over the last few years, such as the attempted murder and then jailing of Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader, the destruction of Russian journalism as it remains, now are clearly premeditated.
Wow, is all I can say to that. I mean, do you think that as well as a Ukrainian refugee issue, we might soon have a Russian refugee issue as well?
Well, traveling around Europe over this year, it was very clear to me that something like the Iron Curtain was descending across the continent, and Belarus, not just Russia, was definitely on the wrong side of it. That was not simply because, until now really, of Putin's aggression and Lukashenko's repression, but also by a lot of decisions that we've made, such as the visa wall that separates countries in the EU and not in the EU, such as Russia and Belarus, Ukrainians have visa-free access to the EU, and then also our COVID regulations, which means a normal Russian, because the EU and many other countries doesn't recognize their Sputnik vaccine, you can't just hop on a plane, and even if you've got the visa to go to Vilnius or to go to kind of Poland or Greece on holiday, because your vaccine's not recognized. And very few Russians are rich enough to get a different vaccine in Moscow or elsewhere in the country, or fly to Serbia and then get another vaccine. So it was very clear, because of our sanctions, our COVID rules, their repression, that the walls had sort of gone up already. Okay. We just couldn't see them by this summer, and now they've come crashing down.
Michael, anything in what Ben says that you disagree with?
No, not at all. I mean, the thing, we've all crossed a perceptual threshold. Until last Thursday, the Western policy, not Ben's writing, which I've read a lot of and admire, but Western policy was always, look, we've got to live with Putin. We've got to contain Putin. He's a nuisance. He's a real nuisance and a dangerous nuisance, but he'll only be strategically important if we let him. And I have to say, that was the view I took. Yeah. Now we've all crossed a perceptual threshold and said, this man's Russia, not Russia, but this man's Russia is a threat to European stability of the sort we've not seen since the 1930s, and we can't play nice with him anymore. People used to say we mustn't fall into a new Cold War. Well, actually, we're already in it, and Ben has put that point, I think, very well.
Ewan, do you want to come back on that?
Yes, I'm just thinking about Belarus and all of this. Will they introduce martial law as well?
The current fear in Belarus is, in fact, of a general mobilization and mass conscription. And just over today, I've been in contact with various people who are attempting to kind of flee Belarus. And it's a moment for us to kind of really start asking really hard questions about Europe's borders and whether we open them, and then what would that do? Like, we're dealing with dictators here. One question we need to ask ourselves is, should we open the border with Belarus? The way that the border was opened with Hungary after 1956 and the Soviet repression of an attempt to create a more autonomous communist regime there. Should we open the border the way, which is what we did in 1989, which triggered such a mass flight that East Germany couldn't cope with it anymore. But at the same time, we need to think kind of twice. If we open the border, does that mean they'll then close it permanently? What's the best way to keep people being able to get out in the long term? What are quick and easy things we should do? Should we lift visa restrictions. And then what does that mean for us as Europeans who've spent decades now trying to stop migration coming in? A lot of tough questions we're going to have to ask ourselves.
Michael.
Yeah, just very quick on Belarus. I mean, Lukashenko has hitched his wagon absolutely to Mr. Putin. There's joined at the hip in the sense that Putin tells him what to do. This is a political crisis in Russia, as Ben said. I mean, this is not just a crisis in European security, but there's a political crisis in Russia. And as somebody said a while ago, Lawrence Friedman, my good friend, he said, regime change in Moscow is about as likely as regime change in Kiev. How long that takes, we don't know. But my point is when Putin collapses, and it might be years, or it might actually be quite quick and sudden, Lukashenko collapses. They go together.
Right, Ewan, thank you for a great opening question. Let's go to Patrick in Stratford. Patrick, hi, what's your question, please?
Yeah, hello, Ian. I've listened to LBC for over 30 years now, and I really enjoy the station, but this is the first time I've been moved to make a phone call.
I feel my work is done.
Yeah, I'd just like to put a question to your experts there. Do you believe that Russia has a legitimate claim when it comes to national security concerning the war in Ukraine?
Okay, Michael.
There's a little bit of legitimacy there in the sense that NATO has enlarged itself consistently in ways that upset the way Mr. Putin thinks about the world. Angela Merkel always said, Mr. Putin's a 21st century leader with a 19th century attitude to security. And the fact is, NATO has enlarged itself 8 times since it was created, 5 times since the end of the Cold War, and 5 times since Mr. Putin has been in power. My quarrel with NATO doing that is not that they enlarged because it was demand-led. It was everybody wanting to come into NATO. It was NATO dealing with states that wanted to get in. They all wanted to get into the EU for prosperity. They wanted to get into NATO for the American guarantee of their security. And NATO was thinking about that. My quarrel with NATO was that they didn't think very strategically. When it was easy in the 1990s and Russia seemed very weak, the fact that the Russians clearly didn't like it, Mr. Putin went to the Munich Security Conference in 1997 and was clearly angry about the way NATO was enlarging. And in a way, we kind of poo-pooed it. We said, well, he just doesn't understand modern politics and he doesn't really understand that NATO is a defensive alliance and he's really getting himself worked up about nothing. We might have been a bit more aware of that, which is not to say that NATO should have appeased Mr. Putin's paranoia, but we should have been a bit more strategically coherent because we've gone from an alliance of 12 in 1949 to an alliance of 30 now. And if you take a 19th century view, what you see is NATO's borders since the collapse of the Soviet Union have come 1,000 miles closer to Moscow. And so we ought to have been a bit more strategically savvy about the way that might be thought about in Russia and have done more to actually either explain it or think it through. And there's all sorts of things we might have done to, as it were, allow countries the benefits of NATO without bringing them in fully to the alliance. But we are where we are. And so if there's a little bit of justification in Mr. Putin's security fears, it's, let's say, 10%. Of that paranoia. The 90% is his sense of wanting to go down as a new czar, of creating a Novorussia, a new Russia, of reversing the decades of the Cold War. All of those things make him a revisionist politician, like Hitler and Mussolini. They are revisionists in the sense that they want to overturn the international order that they inherited.
Ben.
Well, I can assure you that the French president and the German chancellor worked tirelessly up to the very last moment to find a compromise for peace with Putin over all of these legacy issues from the 1990s and these issues to do with NATO. The reason that Ukraine wants to join NATO, Ukraine is an independent country. If you tell it you don't have a right to even say or even ask what alliances you want to join, that's admitting you're not independent. The West didn't want to compromise on the principle they had the right to ask and the principle that we had the right to admit them one day in the far future. But Macron proposed a solution to Putin was, how about a moratorium? This country doesn't join NATO for 20 years, for 30 years. We stop all NATO expansion, and maybe you can stop your fake alliance expanding, even though that's never going to happen. And Putin rejected it out of hand. I can assure you from knowing Russian diplomats and knowing Russian foreign policy scholars who are professionals in their own way, they would have taken the deal. And that's why the French thought that there was a deal until the last moment. But these people were overridden because Putin wanted to launch a war of conquest. He did not want a compromise with the very idea that Ukraine could be an independent country and a compromise with us.
There are so many brilliant questions coming in. We could do this till midnight, but I guess we probably better not. We'll come to more of them in just a moment. You're listening to Iain Dale on LBC. It's 17 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
It's 20 past 8 on LBC. We have Michael Clarke with us, Defence and Foreign Affairs Analyst, former Director General of RUSI, and Ben Judah, who's written a book called Fragile Empire, A Study of Putin's Russia. They're answering your questions, and it's William in Orpington's turn next. Hello, William.
Hello, good evening, Ian. Good evening, Ben and Mr. Clarke. This is a question for Michael, if I may. Since the beginning of the invasion, we've seen the Ukrainian army consolidate itself and supplement itself with the militia. But what we haven't seen on open source reporting is the effectiveness or the existence of the Ukrainian ADGE, the Air Defense Ground Environment. Michael, would you have any comment on that as to what they're actually trying to achieve with their notable absence? I mean, I know that we've witnessed a pair of combat air patrol taken on two FBAs, Russian FBAs, but that's all we've seen. I mean, we haven't seen anything about the surface to air or the air-to-air capabilities. Could you make a comment on that?
Yeah, we have. Yeah, I mean, we should translate this from military jargon, I guess. Is that
He seems to know what he's talking about, doesn't he?
Two Ukrainian MiG-29s tangled yesterday with a couple of Sukhoi 35s, which outclassed them in technical terms. But the story is that one of the Ukrainian MiG-29s came down, but both of the Su-35s came down. I'm not certain if that's confirmed, but that was the story. So there's been a little bit of air combat. One of the questions about this first 8 days of the battle is why the Russians haven't used their air power more. It may be that they feel they don't need to, and that the Ukrainian air defense system has been fairly heavily attacked by cruise missiles and may be been effectively taken down. The Ukrainians are putting a lot of faith in their Bayraktar drones that you will know about, I'm sure. The Turkish drones, which are cheap but very effective if you can use them in enough numbers. Each of them carries four laser-guided bombs, which is what does the damage. And also this Punisher drone, which they've more or less developed themselves, which is an electric drone. And that makes it very stealthy, very hard to pick up on radar. It only carries one bomb, but that's been pretty effective. And this long division, this armoured division column that is tripping over itself at the moment, running down the Dnieper Valley, trying to get towards Kiev, it's basically stopped because of its own inefficiencies. It's a huge target. And the Ukrainians are doing what they can.
Why aren't they bombing it then?
They're trying. I think they're trying. But I mean, it will carry a lot of its own air defence. And there's quite a lot of air defence which is along the Belarusian border, which also covers the area that they're dealing with.
Right.
So the Ukrainians are doing what they can. But I think that what they have of an air force, they started this with about 120 combat aircraft. The Russians had at least double that number in theatre. But we haven't seen much of either of them. And I don't think the Ukrainians are holding them back, because if ever they need them to attack that armoured division. And they're doing their best, but it's not going to stop the armoured division getting to Kiev sometime in the next few days when they get their fuel sorted out and all the rest of it. And they will encircle the city, not as quickly as they wanted, but they will encircle the city in the coming days.
William?
Thank you. My personal assessment of this is, very much in agreement with yours. I think the overlapping aspect is the standoff ranges on both sides, quite long.
Yeah, absolutely right,
The huge ranges of standoff, I suppose, makes them more tentative, a little bit more precautious as they move closer towards each other.
It's the nature of modern warfare that the place where the battle really takes place doesn't seem to have too many people in it. In fact, the battle is taking place, at standoff ranges in the rear areas. I mean, battles are being fought now, as it were, 500 miles on one side and 500 miles on the other. So it's not as obvious as you might have thought, even in battles of 30 years ago. It's the new nature of warfare.
William, thank you. A text question here from Sam in Cambridge. It says, Iain, put simply, how do we stop a narcissistic megalomaniac? Now, Ben, the narrative is developing that in some ways Putin is unhinged, he's narcissistic, he's a megalomaniac. But is that a fair assessment of the situation, or do you think that maybe we should revise that?
So I think that when looking at dictators and regimes of this nature, it's very important to craft policy not around, well, if we sanction a few oligarchs, then it will do this. Or if we put sanctions on the Russian public, then it will do this. The important thing is not to second guess what effect we can have on a regime when we don't really understand how it works. The regime has become a black box. I don't even think we can call it a regime anymore. I think it's a dictatorship. And Putin's mind, certainly from the point of view of strategists or foreign policy thinkers, should be treated as a black box. And what that means is that we have to devise policies really kind of about us and what it means in terms of how we behave. So it's very important for us to go, these are our red lines, do not cross them. This is what we're going to do. This is what matters to us. And we're doing things because it's good for us. We're getting rid of kleptocrats from London because they're bad for us having them here, and because they're sort of disturbing our political system and promoting a sort of savage war of conquest, and we don't want that. Not because we're trying to second guess what can happen in a regime that we don't understand. I think that all of the psychological portraits of Putin should not be how diplomats are approaching this. I think that should be how kind of artists and psychologists at home should be approaching that. But that's not a way to formulate policy.
Right, let's go to David in Sunderland. Hi, David. What would you like to ask?
Hi, Iain. Hi, panel. Yeah, it's a fairly simplistic sort of question in a way. Once Putin sort of like he's actually got his troops into Ukraine, such a vast country, and I assume his ultimate aim is to set up administration areas in different parts of the country. How would he physically sustain that a full-on military presence with all the sort of like problems at the minute, with the West cutting off the logistics of fuel, of air parts, and everything? What would his strategy be on that? It just seems to me that he's put himself there. I don't see how it could sustain itself any length of time, because people can say this war could go on for such a long time. I suppose in theory it can, but I don't know how the Russian army could physically sustain themselves in that kind of sort of vast country that Ukraine is. It's just some views on that, really, because it just seems as though, doesn't seem as though, in my non-military mind, that once you've got yourself there, if you don't achieve your targets within just a short space of time, it becomes, well, I don't know where you go.
Well, it's unsustainable, isn't it? Michael, is there any precedent for a country invading a country of this size and then being able to manage it afterwards?
No. You go back to the Second World War, where you're talking about vast armies of 1.5 million and 2 million. I mean, there's a sort of a rule of thumb in this thing, and it doesn't vary very much, to be honest, from society to society. In a settled society, you need about 2 police or security personnel for every 1,000 members of the population. In a settled society, say like ours. In an unsettled society, or a society that's in the grip of an incipient civil war, you need 20 per 1,000. Right? Now, you can do it on the back of an envelope. The Ukraine is a country of 45 million people. If only 2 or 3% of that 45 million people were active in some way, I mean, if only 1% of them had weapons and another 2 or 3% were actively rebellious, then the number of troops the Russians would need on the basis of 20 per 1,000 is 800,000 to 1 million. They can't do it. And I promise you, although they've got armed forces that run into the millions, the fact is they haven't got the armed forces to do it. It's often said, the Russians have a large modern army. Well, the part of it that's large is not modern, and the part of it that's modern is not large. The fact is they've got a lot of people in uniform, and they've got a rather small part of that army that is competent in the way that we expect modern forces to be competent.
Ben?
Well, Putin has found himself in a position now where he's thinking that I am Stalin. I've been forced to break with the West, like Stalin, having to push the borders as far as I can away from my borders in order to negotiate a Yalta deal afterwards. I'm going to have to move into Stalin-like repression. And we know that Stalin achieved the Sovietization of Eastern Europe after World War II and the Sovietization of the territories he annexed, like the Baltic states, before World War II, through the politics of mass terror. So I am extremely concerned that we are going to see, if Russian occupation zones emerge in large swathes of Ukraine, large-scale deportations westwards, large-scale imprisonments, and we're already seeing in Kherson, which is one of the first major Ukrainian cities to have fallen to the Russians, that there is a military police there with militarized kind of paddy wagons to take people away. So I'm very concerned about the next steps in this.
You want to come back, Michael?
Yeah, just a very quick one. Just to add to that, really, that the US and British intelligence on this issue have been absolutely right since last December. Every detail. They laid it out last December. A lot of people laughed about it. They even put it in part of it in the Washington Post. They've turned out to be right on every single detail so far. One of the things they've also said is that, as Ben is indicating, the Russians have got lists. They've drawn up lists of the people that, politicians, journalists, people who are a nuisance. And those people will be picked up, and they'll disappear. And the fact is, as you said, the Rosgvardia are in there, who are the internal police to look after the civilian population. They've gone in, and with lots of images of their police wagons in convoy going in with the Russians. Where the Russians have got an area that they control, and we're looking at Kherson now and probably Clarke fairly soon. I think we'll go into, and I don't use this word lightly, they'll go into a Gestapo phase. They'll pick people up, they'll disappear, And once there is some organised opposition, once Russian soldiers start getting shot and groups form to resist the Russians, then the people who disappear will disappear via the torture chambers, so that they will reveal who else they know. I mean, Ukraine could be entering a very, very dark period if the intelligence that Britain and America have come up with over the last 6 months is right. And so far, they've been right about everything.
And that's an interesting thing in itself, because obviously the intelligence before the Iraq War was very, very wrong, but we may talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Nick on a text says, these guests are so good, learning a lot. Thanks, Ian. No, thanks to my producer for booking these brilliant guests. Nothing to do with me, Gov, although I endorse them, obviously. It's 8:32. Lottie Morley has the LBC News headlines.
Vladimir Putin insists the invasion of Ukraine is going to schedule, a claim that has been disputed by the West. The mayor of the southeastern city of Mariupol has accused the Russian president of genocide as citizens remain without water, food and electricity. Ukraine says it's reached a tentative agreement with Russia to organise safe corridors for civilians to evacuate and for humanitarian supplies to be delivered. Under the agreement, ceasefires would be observed where safe corridors are created. And Ukraine has requested to postpone their World Cup qualifier against Scotland following Russia's invasion. The two nations were due to meet in Glasgow in 3 weeks' time to play for a place at the World Cup in Qatar, which starts in November. LBC weather, rain spreading east across Scotland and northern England this evening, turning drier for western areas over Northern Ireland, Wales and southwest England, a low of 1 degree.
LBC.
This is
Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
It's 8:36. Well, the fanboy and fangirl texts and tweets are really coming in now. Please, can you invite these guests back every week? They bring clarity to a very scary and uncertain times. We have registered that request. Very funny road sign that is doing the rounds on Twitter now in Ukraine. A lot of Ukrainians have been doctoring road signs to try and prevent the Russians from getting to where they're going. This one, it's a massive motorway sign. It's a straight on. The Hague, right, The Hague, left, The Hague. You've got to admire the Ukrainians, haven't you? Finding humour in these times. Right, Michael Clarke is with us, Defence and Foreign Affairs analyst, and Ben Judah is the author of Fragile Empire, a study of Putin's Russia. Claire's in Edgware. Hello, Claire.
Good evening, Ian, and phenomenal expert.
Well,
yes,
indeed.
My goodness, what an education tonight.
Much better than listening to me, eh?
As Britain has learnt to its chagrin, tariff-free trade, economic success and mutual support lies within the EU. Would the EU expedite and fast-track Ukraine into the EU? They very wisely want it so desperately.
Well, is that possible, Michael? And would it be a good idea in these circumstances?
That's a tough one. I mean, if Ukraine was in a state it was in, a month ago, that would be a tough question because the EU has got lots of convergence criteria. And, I mean, we shouldn't be too holier than thou about this. I mean, Ukraine, had a very corrupt background. It only really started to sort itself out because it wanted to join the Western organizations after about 2012, 2013. Before that, it wasn't, there's a lot wrong with it and the economy was still very lopsided and so on. So, I mean, it would be a tough question anyway for Ukraine, but it, in theory, is on the path. So it might be quite a long path. But now the most immediate question is: will Ukraine continue to exist after this crisis? I mean, what will emerge from this? Because European politics in general now will be completely different after this. Not just dealing with Russia, but we've got to start to think now about what sort of Europe do we think should emerge for the mid-2020s? And that, we can't really think about that until this is over. And then we'll see where we are with Ukraine. But I think, I don't know what Ben thinks about this, but I mean, if Ukraine is taken over, even if it's a civil war, then Moldova next door is in deep trouble. Moldova is very weak. There is a Donbass version in Moldova, the Transnistria area, which is a separatist area of Russians claiming to want to be part of Russia. And remember, there are Russian minorities in Estonia and Latvia who can be manipulated.
Big minorities as well.
Quite 40%. 25%. Yeah. So this crisis has got a long way to run yet in terms of other countries. So I'm not trying to avoid your question, but when we get through the first part of this crisis, which is what's going to happen to Ukraine, we've then got to address some pretty fundamental questions about European security and the new European order, such as it may be.
Ben?
Well, I think that we need to look at it strategically. And one of the things that's difficult if you look at it strategically is that there's a contradiction in what a lot of people on the European continent are saying. They're saying three things. The first is Ukraine, well, it would probably be a good idea if you were neutral, given Russian aggression and these questions of NATO. We've heard some other callers mention. So why don't you be neutral after this war between both blocs? Two, maybe there's some way that we can get you into the EU quicker. But then Europeans are constantly telling us, number three, Europe is a mutual defense alliance and a security actor and a foreign policy power in its own right. So they don't really stack up there. And if you're fast-tracking Ukraine into the EU, as far as Russia's concerned, you're fast-tracking it into another tentacle, another aspect of the Western military alliance, which he is opposing. So it's difficult. And then we need to think about what is Ukraine going to look like after the war. And here there are two very, very difficult choices, contradictions here. Do the Ukrainians want to put first, and it's their decision, it's not our decision, the unity of their country? And that might mean making very, very difficult, very, very painful compromises with Russia and allowing the Russians to have some kind of role in government or put some brutal conditions on them in order to withdraw. Or do they want to put first the integrity of their country? having 100% their own military as strong as they want, not having any Russian limitations. And that might mean being forced to abandon some of these territories, either into a sort of permanent Russian occupation zone, or maybe, depending how things develop, a sort of East Ukraine, which is a Russian puppet state, or maybe they might be forced to learn some lessons of 1939. So right now, the strategists in Washington are trying to work out whether the war is it Stalin's war on Finland in 1939, where the Finns valiantly resisted, stopped a shambolic Russian army from advancing and taking Helsinki, but they had to give up a lot of their territory to stay independent? Or is it Hitler's war on Poland, where Hitler stormed in, spared no quarter, and conquered the country? And one thing I'd like to remind anyone who's passionately Ukrainian is, at this phase in the Nazi invasion of Poland, people in the House of Commons thought Poland was going to win. And the Nazis had not taken any major Polish cities, and actually the Russians are advancing faster. So I think we just need to look at these kind of wars in the historical big picture, which Michael knows a lot more about than I do. And remember, Hitler's invasion of Poland, it took 6 weeks, cost 20,000 German troops. Hitler's invasion of France, it took around the same amount of time, took a similar amount of German troops. Or the Franco-Prussian War, when Prussia, that was about to become Germany, knocked out France. It took 6 months, and they lost 50,000 men, and that came to be viewed by historians as the classic short victorious war. We're just at the beginning of this, but Russia does look like it's running its problems.
Claire, thank you very much for that. Let's go to Rani in Cardiff. Hello, Rani.
Hi, Ronnie. Thank you, Ian. You and LBC have been doing such an exemplary job reporting on this. Thank you. Just wanted to say, I first visited Eastern Europe in the late 80s, and I was asked so much, and especially from elderly people, why did the West abandon Eastern Europe after the war? And I was just wondering, Ben, this question is for Ben, does he think that there will come a point when the Russian people, like the ex-Soviet satellites, will rise up against Putin, or the government and the army will rise up and refuse to follow his orders, or no, because Russia is such a vast country, bigger than Eastern Europe countries were, and because of the block of news?
I think that's a really interesting question. We've had quite a lot of questions along similar lines, sort of what would happen after Putin. Here's one from Paul on Twitter. If Putin died tonight, would the problem be solved? So let's combine that. Sort of what is Putin's grip on power as tenuous as maybe some commentators are suggesting, Ben?
I really want to keep stressing, we don't know what's going on in Putin's head. We can guess. We don't really know what's going on in the Kremlin. The fact this war caught so many people by surprise shows that we don't really know what's going on in there. We can't formulate policy towards that as Western governments. When you look at the political science, it's pretty depressing, to be honest. The political science tells you that once you've got a one-man rule dictator like Putin, they almost only ever fall from coups or death. And the key variable about whether or not there's even a chance of them falling by popular revolution is, do they have oil? And when a dictator has oil, so when we're, right now, we are paying Putin's companies, Rosneft and Gazprom, billions a day that he can then spend in slaughtering Ukrainians and repressing his own people. When they have money just spurting out of the ground like that, they don't need to care about middle classes or about oligarchs, because they've got enough money to keep the repression machine going. The political science says that when a dictator has oil, he is almost always going to be able to resist international sanctions and demobilize society. In terms of what's going on inside the Kremlin, really, it's palace life. Like, I can't tell you, no expert can tell you exactly what's going on, and chances of a coup would depend on things there. Right now, Putin just gave a frothing speech to the Russian people saying that the war is proceeding at schedule, even though they won't call it a war, he calls it an anti-terror operation. And he's saying that he will never abandon his belief that Russians and Ukrainians are one people and he's fighting neo-Nazis. Certainly, he doesn't look like he's taking his foot off the gas.
Michael?
Yeah, dictatorships, throughout the 20th and 21st centuries now, they last an awful long time, longer than anyone thinks they could, because when you've got the levers of power and you're prepared to be ruthless, then you can keep on going for a long time. There's a famous novel by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, The Autumn of the Patriarch, of a very, very old man drifting through his palace. He'd long since become a drooling fool. And that's what tends to happen to long-term dictators. When they go with a single push. And people wonder, why did we live through the last 10 or 15 years when this man was clearly a drooling fool? They go with a single push, but they last a long time before circumstances combine to give them that little push. The question here is whether, this is such a monumental mistake, strategic error by Putin, who thinks of himself as cunning. He thought he was incrementally clever. He was always outfoxing the West, being able to move quickly. This is a monumental error, taking on something he can't possibly do, i.e. control Ukraine in any sensible way, in any way that makes sense in Russian terms, that he is in this situation now where the pressure will only build on him, but it might take a long time. When he goes, he'll go with a single push. But whether that's in a month's time or 5 years' time, I wouldn't dare speculate.
Linda says, hi Ian, could we send in our SAS to get rid of Putin? I think that would be a very dodgy thing to do. I think the only person that could do that is Jack Bauer, and unfortunately 24 has come to an end. We'll take more of your calls in a moment. It's 8:48.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Weekday mornings from 7.
Ina Sovson is a Ukrainian MP. What is the situation as you understand it in your city?
I've read the story yesterday of twins born in a bunker in Kharkiv, and they were born the night before. And yesterday, both of their parents were killed in another bombardment. They became orphans first day of their life. That is what Putin is doing to my native city of Kharkiv. He is basically just destroying the city. He's turning it to Aleppo in the middle of Europe in the 21st century.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC.
Nipping out to get bin bags.
LBC. Text 84850.
It's 8:51. Michael Clarke and Ben Judah with me answering your questions. Paul is in Fort Worth in Texas. Hello, Paul.
Hey, good afternoon.
Hi.
Good evening to you guys. My question is, do you think, I know you said you thought it was the Afghanistan which kicked it over the edge, but don't you think that Putin was grooming Trump in the direction of this 12, 18 months ago, to push him to get out of NATO, and NATO wasn't doing this and that? That is the question. I mean, I thought it was pretty obvious, but what do you guys think?
It's interesting. A lot of people say, would this have happened if Trump had been president? Well, the answer is we will never know. But Ben, you're in the United States. What's your view on Paul's question?
Well, I just think something really worth kind of pointing out is that Trump actually at CPAC, that's kind of major conference of conservative forces to those who aren't in the United States, actually was praising Zelensky, saying that Zelensky, the kind of Ukrainian leader, was fighting like a lion, looking really impressive. A lot of Trump's relationship with Putin was deeply psychological, and by the idea of like the manly man and the boss and like who was, the toughest guy on the scene. And now, Zelensky has turned from looking like a kind of comedian president in the eyes of the world to looking like an iron joker, sort of murdering Russian forces with drones. Trump's suddenly interested in him. So I think that with Trump, there were obviously kind of things going on with Russia, but his veneration of the warrior man is a big part of it. And him seeing that Putin's no longer where it's at in terms of that is a very interesting sign for American public opinion going forward.
Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that anybody outside the Republican Party in the States takes much notice of what ex-President Trump says. But I mean, he always presented himself as a tough negotiator. In fact, he was an absolute pussycat. There are four big countries in the world in the 21st century, all big for different reasons: America, China, India, and Russia, all for different reasons. If in some sort of play you wrote, Trump went into a room to negotiate world politics with Putin, Modi, and Xi Jinping of China, he would come out in his underwear. I mean, they would take him for everything, because they're cunning, clever people who are well briefed. I mean, Trump, you go into meetings, and he wasn't very well briefed, and I think he knew that he couldn't hold his own in a meeting of good leaders who actually knew what they were talking about.
But he wrote the art of the deal. Surely that was his selling point. He was a big negotiator.
He was hopeless at doing deals. And he would wreck meetings rather than go along with it, because he knew he couldn't survive. And he would go into meetings at NATO, and then he'd leave after a while. All leaders leave meetings for a few minutes. Sometimes they go to the bathroom, sometimes they go out for a quick word, and they come back. And he would leave after 20 minutes and not come back. And everybody around the table would be making speeches for his benefit, and he just wasn't there. Or he'd dominate the agenda. He would say, no, we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what I want to talk about. And he would wreck meetings that he couldn't control. And he was, in one sense, he knew he couldn't hold his own in those meetings. So, I mean, Trump was never a tough guy. And he was impressed by Putin because, I think as Ben said, there's a match almost a sort of homoerotic sort of thing. But it was a man's man sort of attitude.
Someone here is disagreeing with you. They say that that's wrong. Trump was praising Putin after the invasion of Ukraine.
He was to start with, and then he changed. No, okay. He first of all said Putin's done a wonderful thing, and he said he's brilliant by calling these people peacekeepers. And then within 24 hours, he suddenly realised he'd said something, I think, even more foolish, and he's praising Zelensky. I mean, Trump flip-flops on everything because, as he said, he swims in the shallower end of the intellectual pool.
That's a good way of putting it.
I agree, by the way.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Paul. Madam Editor on Twitter says, it's not Jack Bauer. She says, I feel as if we're living through an episode of Madam Secretary. Do you think Putin watched that show? It was one of my favourite ever programmes, Madam Secretary. Now, Pat on an email says, if the British intelligence was so spot on, as your guests have said, which I agree with, but did previously doubt because of the historical lies about WMDs, why have we been so slow to have everything in place and ready with regard to sanctions, providing supplies and weapons, and creating supply lines, etc.? Also, could Ukraine have spent the past few months preparing for the invasion and subsequent siege on their cities? Well, surely one of the answers to that is that most of the commentatorati and even military people did not think that Putin was going to invade. And clearly people within government circles didn't. Otherwise, they would have had these things in line, Michael.
Yeah, it's a very good point that intelligence says one thing, but doesn't mean to say that governments do it, because intelligence is only one part of the policy picture. And the Ukrainians, they were advised by Western militaries to drop the bridges, get the bridges down or mine the bridges, and they didn't do it. Partly because they didn't want to, they knew the Russians would see that, they didn't want to provoke Russia. And so for quite a long time, the Ukrainians, as it were, felt very uncomfortable, but in a sense pretended that this could never happen, because they thought if they began to prepare, it would make it more inevitable. But you're absolutely right. I mean, just like with Afghanistan, we knew a year before the withdrawal that it was going to happen. And did we prepare? No, we didn't. There's a sort of vacuum at the heart of some governments when it comes to preparing for things that are not inevitable but are one possibility. And very often governments face a situation where, look, there's 2 or 3 things here that might happen. You should think about all of them, not just the one that you think is the most likely.
Ben?
Yeah, I think that when it comes to the British government was one of the first in Europe to really wake up to the danger because of intelligence. It is actually quite impressive the way that Britain, at considerable cost in international diplomatic circles, was the first country to raise the prospect of militarily arming the Ukrainians to a new level. Went ahead and did that, opened the door for our allies in Eastern Europe to do that. It was the first country to call for Nord Stream 2, this sort of pipeline that Germany and Russia have been trying to build between them, to be scrapped. And it was one of the first countries to propose pulling Russia out of the SWIFT international payments system. You know, Britain has done pretty well on the diplomacy and building up for this. There's been a long-standing build-up in Ukraine, with Britain training over 20,000 snipers. And the weapons that Britain gave have all seen impact. And there's specific handheld anti-tank weapons, because that was what the Ukrainians needed in order to deal with this kind of invasion scenario. In terms of where Britain could have done better, the British political system really is at its best when it can rally around a strong, internationally respected prime minister that can cut a dash like Tony Blair or Margaret Thatcher had done. And we didn't have that, as any British listener knows. But the French, for example, did, and that's how Macron managed to play a diplomatic role. But in terms of being ready for impact, Britain was more ready than France. But let's not forget that the Ukrainians themselves didn't believe this was going to happen, because Putin might insist that Ukraine and Russia are one people. It's obviously not true, but they do feel kind of a sense of kinship, and it was viewed as being as unrealistic as if England invaded Scotland.
Well, now there's a thought. I remember interviewing many people in the last month or so, because I must say I always thought Putin was going to invade. I'm not saying, well, wasn't I right, but I couldn't believe the people I was interviewing in Ukraine just were going about their everyday lives without a care in the world. And well, I suppose that lots of books are going to be written about this over the next few years, aren't they? Listen, Michael, Clarke, Ben Judah, thank you so much for joining us over the last hour. I think it's been the most informative hour on LBC since this crisis started, and I think you've really educated our audience greatly over the last 60 minutes. Thank you very much, and let's hope we can do it again very, very soon.